Well, thank you again, everyone, for being with us, and happy Easter. Some wonderful memories of this time of the year, and as we were getting started on the conference bridge, people were sharing, some of the meals we're cooking, the things we're doing to get ready for family. All of these are just great memories, just great memories. Last night on Facebook, someone posted an old advertisement from Buster Brown Shoes, and it was their Easter lineup of shoes for kids, and it just brought back such a precious memory for me of when I was little and Easter would come, and my grandmother from Brooklyn would come to visit, and it was her tradition that every year she would take my brother and I, and she would take us and buy us new clothes, or our new Easter suit and our new Easter shoes for the year. So we lived in a very small town, and there was one dry goods store, and that was it. So she would take us on the bus, and we had to ride 2 or 3 towns over, and there was a Buster Brown shoe store and a Robert Hall's, and she would take us there, and they would measure us up, and we would get a new pair of shoes, and we would get a new suit every Easter, and then of course we would get back on the bus, and we would ride back home. So just wonderful memories. So we want to look today at what is this idea of Easter? What is this idea of death and resurrection all about? At a deeper level. Remember, we keep saying that religion is when we believe in somebody else's experience, but spirituality is having our own experience. And what these holidays and these festive times of the year, what they trying to tell us, what they seem to tell us, is there something deep within the human psyche that recognizes and has a need, if we want to call it that, a need to rejoice, a need to experience, to express, to enjoy life in some particular way. And it goes with the seasons. It naturally goes with the seasons, because when we lived outside, when we worked outside in the fields or fishing or hunting, or the things that we used to do when we had to make our living outside, people were very in touch with the seasons. They were very in touch with the signs in the heaven, and certain constellations would be in the sky at a certain time of the year, and people would know when a certain constellation started to appear right before sunrise. When Orion started to appear right before sunrise, and they would know that winter wasn't far away. People were very in touch with the length of the days, the solstices, and all of these things. And each of them seemed to have a special significance. It's if you read Carl Jung's work on man and his symbols, Carl Jung says the same symbols arise in the dream consciousness of people all over the world and have the same general meaning, the same general significance. And he says, why is that? And he called this the collective unconscious, right? That even though you and I and everyone appears to be a separate individual, that we are not really separate, that we are all connected back into what is called, or what he called, the collective unconscious. So there's this something that exists then in the collective unconscious that is trying to express itself through human beings, and that what we as human beings tend to do is we express that in the costumes and in the characters that are particular to our culture, to the culture that we grow up in, the culture in which we live. And I'll just give you an example, and kind of Joseph Campbell expanded on this a little bit in his works on the Hero with 1,000 Faces. In the Plains Indians of North America, in the culture of the Plains Indians in North America, there is a mythology about where corn came from. Now, corn was, of course, a very vital food source for that culture. And the mythology, the mythology comes that one day a god visited the people, and sacrificed itself, had itself killed, had its head buried in the soil, and out of that the first corn stalk arose. Now, you and I, not being from that culture, we look at that and say, well, that's a story. That every culture has a mythology about where food came from. Every culture has a mythology about where fire came from. A very important event, in human history, and it's memorialized in different ways. But if we take this example of where the corn came from in the mythology of the Plains Indians, and we travel, halfway around the world to the South Pacific, there is a very similar mythology about where the coconut came from. And one day a young god appeared first as a giant eel, and then this eel turned into a handsome young man, and he married this princess of the tribe that lived on this island. And then one day told her, he said, you have to kill me, and you have to cut my head off, and you have to bury my head in the soil. And he gave of his body, but out of that very spot where his head was buried, the first coconut tree came. And of course the coconut was a very, very important source of food and other materials for that culture. So there's something, if we go back then, we can say, well, there's something within the human psyche, there's something there that understands the miracle of food, understands that we must somehow be one with this very substance that we're eating. How could our bodies take the corn, for example, or the coconut, or anything else that we eat? How can our bodies take that and digest it and turn it into the nutrients that we need? Some muscles, some bones, some transparent cells as eyes. There's something else that's going on there, and we are all connected through it. And there seems to be this recognition of that. There's something within us that knows that, and it comes out and it expresses in the costumes and the colors and in the characters of the particular culture. So what we might say then, if we look at any particular religion or any particular religious practice, we might say that is the way that this more fundamental principle is coming into expression in that culture, in that time. But there's something deeper. There's something even deeper there that we want to recognize. Now, Carl Jung, for those who are kind of interested in in trivia, Carl Jung was a Gnostic, and you hear me talk all the time about the three levels of spiritual understanding. The fundamental level, which is dogma and creed, and is very important. Behavior is very important within that. So dogma and creed might say, for example, we have this book. This is our book of scripture, and this book is right, and this book is the only right book. And if you're reading anything else, it's wrong, and you need to read this, and you need to study this, and you need to take it. You need to take it at its word. Gnosticism might say, well, this is a very good book. This is certainly an inspirational book. But we can't take it literally. We have to understand. Gnosis means an understanding. We have to understand. And the understanding of this book is not an intellectual understanding. It is not about understanding the meanings of the words and how it got translated from one culture to another culture and how meanings change and all that. All that is helpful. All that is helpful in bringing us to an understanding, but the final understanding must be a knowing from within, a gnosis from within, a deeper understanding. Something within us that knows and reveals to us through intuition, through inspiration, through those kind of things. So this is kind of Carl Jung's orientation. In fact, I think Elaine Pagels wrote a book called The Gnostic Jung, which is interesting if you are interested in any of the history of how human thought evolved. So you can kind of understand then with Carl Jung's kind of orientation towards Gnosticism, you can understand him saying there's a deeper something within us deeper symbols within us. There's a deeper meaning that we need to become aware of and not get so caught up in the particular details. And if we look at this time of the year, if we look at the spring time of the year, which is when Easter comes, which is when Passover came, if we look at this, we see these themes arising in different cultures. Now, one thing, again, for those who are interested in trivia, one thing is we know that in Christianity that the crucifixion in the Gospels took place during the Passover, the Jewish Passover. And the Jewish Passover was set according to a lunar calendar. It was tied to the first full moon following the spring equinox. And of course the lunar calendar, it shifts. The lunar cycle is 28 and a half days, which, by the way, the moon goes away for a couple of days every month, and then it's reborn. There's a symbolism there. It's reborn. But given that the lunar calendar, the lunar month is only 28 and a half days, and the rest of the calendar is off, you can see that the first Sunday following the first full moon could shift. And this is why Easter varies from year to year. It could be closer to the equinox. It could be up to 28 and a half days away from the equinox. But nevertheless, people who lived outside, who were aware of the change of the seasons, this is the way they kept time. This is the way they reckoned time. And it was easy. It was an easy thing for people to understand. They knew when the equinox was. They knew when the next full moon was. It was an easy thing to understand. But what happened is that the intellect became involved, and different organizations that wanted to be in charge, whether they be governments or churches or things like that, they came up with their own calendars. And it drifted because the solar year is, as we know now, 365 and 1/4 days. The lunar year is 28 and a half days approximately. And there has to be adjustments made to any calendar that you come. So what happened was, there is the actual lunar cycle when the full moon occurs, and then there's the liturgical lunar cycle, which is when the authority of the church said the full moon should occur, and things drifted apart. I'm smiling because I could just see human beings at work here with power and control saying, no, don't pay attention to what you see in the sky. Pay attention to what we're telling you. But nevertheless, even though we kind of get skewed a little bit in our reckoning of time, this springtime, this Easter time that Easter comes, and the word Easter predates Christianity. The word Easter goes way back, and in different cultures it was pronounced differently. But it had to do with this idea of life coming back, springtime, life coming back. The goddess of fertility in some cultures was Esther or Oester. See, this is springtime. This is when the lambs are being born and coming into the field. This is when the crops are starting to come back to life. The symbols that we have today that we use in celebrating Easter, the Easter egg itself and bunny rabbits and little chickens and things like that, this is all symbolism. This is all symbolism that is pointing back to a deeper something within the human psyche that recognizes the cycle of life beginning again, life renewing itself. Of course, the bunny rabbit was a sign of abundance and reproduction and just life growing. The eggs, the colorful eggs itself, I think they came from Egypt, and that was a sign of prosperity, again, abundance. And the chicken in the egg, if you think about it, if you think about the symbolism of the tomb and the stone that had to be rolled back from the tomb, and the little chicken pecking its way out of its shell, You can see it. You can see how it's there. I mean, think about that little chicken. Its whole life up until that moment exists inside that shell. And yet there's something within the chicken itself that tells it when it is time to break out, when it is time to punch its way out. And life itself has even provided the chickens with a special tooth, an egg tooth. It's a special tooth that develops on their beak that helps them to peck out. But this is a gnosis, this is a knowing, this is an internal something within the chicken that says, now is the time. Now is the time. You know, if we go and try to take eggs out of an incubator and we try to crack them open and take that little chicken out before it's time, it will die. If we somehow could seal that egg so that the chicken couldn't break its way out, it would die. But left alone to the intelligence, to the wisdom that is within nature, at the exact perfect time for that chick, it knows when to peck its way out. See? And I think we have to keep that symbolism in mind when we come to this idea of Easter, what Easter is all about immortality. See, this theme of death and resurrection, this theme of immortality exists in many times in many places. There is something within the human psyche. There's something within the very soul of humanity that recognizes that this thing that we call life is eternal, is immortal. So I probably ought to define those two words as we're using them today. So kind of immortal means something different than eternal. But they're sometimes used interchangeably. But by immortal, what we're saying is without death. And eternal, what we're saying is without time. Without time. Now, if we live in an environment that is lush, if we live in an environment that is covered with vegetation, if we live in the tropics, or even here where we are in southeastern United States, it's easy to see at this time of the year how everything comes back to life. How everything comes back to life. Trees that fell, appeared to be dead, they start to put up new shoots, come out of the stump. Some of them even from the log that's laying on the ground. Other trees will start to grow. That which appeared to be dead is now coming back to life. The grass which had turned brown is now turning green. We're starting to see the animals come back from wherever they were in the wintertime, wherever they go. They start to come back. The last few days, when I go out into the driveway, there's a squirrel just sitting there, kind of like saying, "Hey, where you been? Been waiting for you." Just sitting there. Bunny rabbits in the yard. The cardinals are returning, and we can hear their song in the morning. And there's no doubt that life is returning where life appeared to have been gone, but it wasn't gone. It wasn't gone. I think there's a quote from Rumi that says, even in the wintertime, even though the flowers appear to be dead, down below the soil, the roots are having a party. Something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing it. So at this time of the year, then, in different cultures, in different parts of the world, and of course spring occurs different times in the north and the south hemisphere, northern and southern. But people recognize a deeper connection to life, a deeper connection to life. So where we want to come to today, what we want to consider then is not the religious interpretation, but the spiritual. interpretation. Remember, religion is based on somebody else's ideas, somebody else's experience. Spirituality is based on our own experience. It's kind of interesting, if you look at any particular religion, if you try to study it by the textbook, if you try to just go to the library and get a book about any particular religion and read it, it really doesn't tell you about the experience of the adherents. They try to define it in a very intellectual way. If when I was studying for the ministry, and I was looking at different religions, I decided to explore the Egyptians and see what I could learn about the different Egyptian religions. And I learned very little. I had a lot of facts, I had a lot of details, I had a lot of names of gods, I had a lot of names of holidays. But I never gained an understanding of what it meant in the daily life of somebody living in ancient Egypt who was an adherent to that religion. See, there's something within the individual. There's something within the individual who is engaged in that particular form of religious practice. There's something within them that is going on that the books can't capture. This is the gnosis. This is the knowing. There's something happening, perhaps at a spiritual level. Perhaps there's a spiritual awakening as people enter a sacred place, whether it be a temple or a church or as Campbell would tell us, a cave. As we enter this sacred place, we're doing it for a purpose. We're doing it for the purpose of having our own spiritual experience. So we don't want to just know the intellectual facts. We don't want to just know what scholars will tell us about a particular religion, about Easter Sunday and Christianity. We want to come to ask ourselves, what does that mean to me? What does this experience mean to me? Meister Eckhart, around Christmas, I always tell the story of Meister Eckhart, who told a Catholic priest in around the year 1300, who told his congregation that they were there to celebrate the birth of a baby in Palestine some 1300 years prior. But unless the people knew what it meant to them personally, it may as well not have occurred. And I think we can say the same thing about any of these holidays that we go through. What does it mean to me? It's not about chocolate. It's not about bunny rabbits. It's not about eggs. Although watching the children look for the eggs is a precious memory, a great delight. But what this is about, it is about that part of the human soul, the human psyche, the collective unconsciousness, as Jung called it, the race consciousness, as Dr. Holmes called it. It is about that part of us that recognizes that we are part of life which is immortal. We are part of life which is eternal, even though we're living in an experience of time and of space. We are part of that which is timeless. We are part of that which is formless. Even though we live in a world where we have an experience of birth and life and death, we are part of that which was never born, and part of that which shall never die. So in the world of symbolism, in this idea then of looking at what can we take from the symbolism of of Easter? What can we take from this idea of death and resurrection? What can we take from this idea of rolling back the stone? I think we can come into a spiritual experience of our own. What does it mean to me? What is this telling me about the evolution of my own soul? What is this telling me about what I identify with? What I identify with. Everything in life, everything that we know of, every living thing contains within itself the seed of the next generation. The seed of the next generation. We take a couple of kernels of corn and we plant them in the soil, and we get back a couple of ears of corn, and each ear of corn is filled with kernels that can then produce more and produce more and produce more. And we have to ask ourselves then, where did the first kernel of corn come from? When I was a kid, my dad used to like to ask me what came first, the chicken or the egg. He'd say, well, the chicken came first because the chicken laid the egg. I say, but if there was no egg, where did the chicken come from? Where does life start? Where does life start? So we look at any particular form of life. We look at the chicken, we look at the egg, we look at the kernel of corn, we look at the stalk of corn and the ear of corn, and we can say, I don't know where it started. I don't know where it started. I just know that this is how it is expressing itself now. And we see then as the growing season comes to an end, the natural process would be that the stalk of corn would fall over. The kernels of corn would not only provide feed for the animals, but would provide enough seed to continue, for life as corn to continue. So we see within nature, we see that there is what appears to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. But there's really an ending and a period of inactivity, the winter cycle, and then a rebirth, and then a rebirth. So it appears to be a death, inactivity, and then a rebirth. We look around us and we see that this is true for everything. This is true for everything around us. And where did this life come from? What is the very nature of this life? Is it many, many different lives, each individual, each separate from the other? Or as Jung said, are we connected? The human race, are we connected through a collective consciousness? And are we connected to other species? Or are we connected to other forms of life? You hear the experiments of people who were told to think kind thoughts that are towards their plants, and other people who were told to think mean thoughts. And allegedly the one group of plants did better than the other. Are we connected? Are we connected with our animals? Can they sense what we're thinking? And all of these different things that start to come up that make us wonder, are we really separate? Or are we part of something that is bigger and we don't know where it started? And if we don't know where it started, how can we say where it ends? We start to recognize then that life is. That is all we can say, is that life is. And life is expressing itself in many different ways, in many different shapes, in many different forms, but it continues on. It continues on. And what's absolutely amazing to me is when we look just on this planet, just on planet Earth, at the many different ways that life expresses itself. It seems that it doesn't matter what the conditions, the environmental conditions might be. Life found a way to express itself. They're looking at things that they're finding they're drilling holes through the ice in Antarctica and drawing lake water out from lakes that are miles below the frozen surface and finding things that live there. You send submersibles down to the deepest ocean trenches, to the vents where there's no sunlight down there, and there's no oxygen down there. And yet life is expressing itself in a unique way, able to live off of what is there. The sulfur, the hydrogen sulfide. We have to look at this and we have to say there is something beyond, before, there is something compelling all of that to happen. And that is what we call life. That is what we call life. So we come to recognize then that this thing that we call life, if we go back and then look at the different scriptures and what they tell us, God says, I am. I am. The Tao is. God is. Life is. We come to not only understand intellectually, but we come to start to experience this unity of life, this oneness, this isness, this suchness of life. And we see then that life in and of itself is immortal. It was never born. It shall never die. It simply goes through changes and transitions and expresses itself in new and wonderful ways. And it seems that each generation contains within itself the seed of the next experience, the next generation. So we start to come to this realization then that what we probably have been identifying with our whole lives is we have been identifying with the human experience. We think that we are our body. We think that we are the experiences that we have had growing up. We think that we are our jobs in many cases. You ask people who they are and they'll tell you what they do for a living. We are none of those. We are none of those. We simply are. We simply are. We are simply a unique, wonderful, individualized expression of that one life. So to put this into symbolic terms, we have to lay down the old Adam. Adam was literally man of the earth, or clay man. Right? Remember in the book of Genesis, in the beginning, God took 100 pounds of clay and he breathed life into it. Whose life did God breathe into it? The life that animated that lump of clay. It is the very life of the divine. Inspire. The very life of the divine is what animates us. The bodies that we have are the clay of the earth that are taking this form at this time, which is appropriate for expression of life in this place. But life itself is immortal. Life itself is without time. As we start to develop from a religious experience of learning the things that we were taught, learning to regurgitate the answers that our teachers wanted, reciting prayers due to a particular formula and those sorts of things. And it was an important part of our learning process as we grew. We start to have the experience of the presence of the divine. We start to identify less and less with the physical and more with the force that animates the physical. We start to put on the new Adam. We are born again, to put it in another terminology. As Paul said, when I was a child, I spoke as a child, but I'm no longer a child. When we were spiritual children, we spoke as humans. But now we must step away from the cloak of humanity, from our identification with our humanness, and we must rise up in spirit. We must rise up in spirit. The symbolism then of the crucifixion, the burial in the tomb, the resurrection on Easter morning, to me, what it means to me is not about commemorating an event that happened a long time ago, but it is about my own personal, spiritual experience of laying down the old and being born again into the new. Renewing life. As life renews itself in the garden every year. Renewing awareness of our spiritual nature. Coming to the recognition that we are more than our skin and our bones. But we are the one observing the skin and the bones. We are the one having the experience of the skin and the bones. And that we are, is immortal, is eternal. So in the gospel narratives of resurrection on Easter Day, and there's different ones if you read through, and in fact, if anybody's interested in a slightly different history of the Easter stories, I recommend a book by Thomas Sheehan, who is a Jesuit, and it's called The First Coming. And in his book, he kind of deals with this idea of the disciples recognizing the spiritual nature of Jesus. And in his recounting of the story, it took time. It took years before the people had this. The resurrection experience occurred within them, with their realization. And he points back to old manuscripts of the New Testament that did not have the resurrection story included. And you'd have to say, well, that arguably is the most important event in Christianity, and it wasn't there. And some people say, well, that page got lost, it fell out of the book. And in his interpretation, he says, no, it took time. It took time for people to have that realization that the very presence of God had been in their midst. So one of the things, if you look through the narratives, you find different stories. When the stone was put there, who rolled the stone away, all those kinds of things. And I believe it was Sheen who raised the question. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was Emmett Fox. What is the significance of the stone? You see, you would have to believe that a divine power that could reanimate a corpse would not be hindered by a stone. And in fact, in later narratives, we have Jesus passing through walls and dematerializing in one place and materializing someplace a distance away, not bound by the physical constraints of the human body. So why the stone? Why is there a stone in the story? And I think to me, the stone signifies that you and I, in our path of awakening, in our path of moving in our consciousness, which is what we are, moving in our consciousness from this idea of believing that we are only human, to awakening to our spiritual nature, to our own resurrection experience, if you want to call it that, to our own rebirth, that we have to roll back the stone too. And the stone is all of the old limiting ideas and beliefs that we allow to block us from experiencing our spiritual nature. Catch yourself every time you say, but I'm only human. Catch yourself every time you're buying into race consciousness. And instead start to think of yourself as a spiritual being here on an adventure, on a holiday, as the Aborigines would say. We come from the dream time, we go back to the dream time. We are here for a holiday. We are here to learn and to grow. We are here to express life uniquely and wonderfully. We are not here to be burdened with the ideas that we are only human. So just like the egg with the chick inside, the shell served as a perfect environment to protect that chick while it was growing, while it was developing. But at some point, when the chicken knew, when something within the chicken guided it, it had to break out. It had to give up that which was encapsulating it and preventing its further growth, and in fact would have killed it if it did not escape. Something within the chicken knew when it was time to do that. There is something within you and I. There's something within each and every one of us. There's something within us. We have our own spiritual egg tooth that tells us when it is time to chip away at the ideas of mortality, of humanness, of materialism, and recognizing that it is time to let the spirit come out of its shell. I often say there's only one question that we as human beings must ever really decide upon. Did matter create consciousness, or did consciousness create matter? When we are stuck in the belief of the physical, of the material, of the human, we are stuck in the belief that it is matter that creates consciousness. When we roll back the stone, we step into the belief that it is consciousness that creates matter. You and I are consciousness. We are an individualized expression of the consciousness of the divine. We did not create ourselves. Our parents did not create us. We came from the dream time. And that consciousness is eternal, without time. That consciousness is immortal, without body. That consciousness is the awareness that I am. And I am spirit. So I invite you this Easter season, I invite you as you go around and you look at all of the beautiful celebrations of life and the celebrations of abundance and the celebrations of joy, as you look at the beautiful flowers that are starting to bloom, and if you look at how green everything in nature is getting, look back beyond the appearances and sense and feel and experience the life that is pushing itself forward perfectly in every situation. And recognize then that that is the very essence of what you are. And when it comes time to lay down these bodies, the seed of our next experience is already within us. And we step forward into a new adventure. And so it is.